Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Hauntflix Horrors, the place where nightmares come to life. If you love spine-chilling tales that send shivers down your spine, you've come to the right place. Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button for more terrifying stories that will keep you up at night. Are you ready to be scared? Because the darkness is waiting. Let's dive in. My family owns a cabin in the mountains that my great-grandfather originally built. Over the decades, my grandfather, father, and I have all added to it, transforming it from a small 2-room structure into a 2-story, 5-room cabin with a porch. Upstairs is a bedroom with 2 beds, and downstairs is the living room, kitchen, bathroom, and study. The study has an old steel tanker desk my grandpa put there, bookshelves full of hunting, fishing, and trapping books, and a ton of old sci-fi novels my dad read as a kid. I decided to spend the summer at the cabin between college semesters to maintain the property. Neighbors had complained of vandalism and theft, and my dad was worried about someone breaking into the cabin. So, I packed up my old truck with food and supplies, brought along a rifle and a revolver, and even brought my dog, Max, a loyal Australian shepherd. The 5-hour drive to the cabin was peaceful, and when I arrived, I was greeted by the serenity of nature. I knew I'd be alone for the summer, with the only human contact being occasional trips into town for gas and food. But that was fine by me. I spent the first day unloading supplies, starting the generator, turning on the lights, and settling in. Nothing unusual happened that night. The next day, I got to work mowing the grass, clearing trails, cleaning deer blinds, and removing wasp nests from the eaves of the cabin. Max kept freezing and staring off into the woods like he saw something, but he would eventually shrug it off and follow me. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the solar panels and checking batteries, planning to use the generator only for the AC or TV. The TV was an old console style from the 60s, and while it didn't pick up any channels, I had my childhood NES hooked up to it, which was nostalgic. That night, I cooked some chili on the gas stove and admired the view from the kitchen window. The motion-triggered lights picked up a raccoon behind the cabin, and I watched it while I cooked. I ate in the living room while reading an old hunting book. The lights started dimming, and I realized the solar cells weren't charging the batteries properly. I called it an early night to save the batteries. The next day, I tried to figure out why the batteries weren't charging, but I was completely clueless. Max was acting increasingly nervous, refusing to leave my side and constantly staring into the woods, whining. I gave up on fixing the batteries and decided to run solar power by day and the generator at night. Later, I set off into the woods to check the fence line, with my grandpa's old .38 revolver on my hip in case of snakes or other threats. Max's anxiety was making me uneasy, but everything else seemed normal. While checking the fence, I noticed it was damaged in a few places. I made a note of where repairs were needed and continued. Suddenly, Max started barking and snarling. I turned to look, but didn't see anything. I drew my revolver and called out, but there was no response. Max charged into the woods, barking, and something big went crashing through the brush. I called for Max and chased after him, worried he might run into a bear. Suddenly, I heard Max yelp and saw him running back to me with his tail between his legs. A loud, unnatural roar echoed through the trees, and something large was crashing through the brush ahead. I hadn't seen what Max had chased, and at that point, I didn't want to. We ran back to the cabin, and I immediately loaded my rifle, a .308 Gibbs carbine that I brought just in case of a bear encounter. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to relax, but keeping the rifle nearby. That night, I cooked dinner, fed Max, and read more of my book, keeping a close eye on the windows. The next morning, I set out to finish checking the fence line, taking the rifle with me this time. Max was even more anxious, shaking and growling while keeping close to me. His behavior was making me nervous, but the woods seemed normal, filled with the sounds of birds and squirrels. When I reached the creek, things got bizarre. The berry bushes were picked clean, and I suspected a bear had been around. There were strange footprints in the mud, too big and oddly shaped to be from any animal I knew. As I inspected them, something flew through the air and landed near me, a pine cone. Then another. Someone was throwing pine cones at me. I shouted a warning, telling whoever it was they were trespassing on private property and that I was armed. There was no response, just another pine cone followed by a large stick. I threw it back and yelled that I was calling the sheriff. A rock sailed at me from the trees, hitting me hard enough to hurt. Forget this, I thought. I flipped off the safety on my rifle and fired a shot into the air. Silence. I chambered another round and yelled again, warning them to leave. Then, a barrage of rocks, sticks, and other debris came flying at me from the woods. Max yelped as a rock hit him, and I still couldn't see who or what was throwing things. I fired another shot, this time into the woods, aiming at the direction of the rocks. There was that same loud roar, followed by crashing sounds in the brush. Max and I ran back to the cabin with the unseen assailant pursuing us, hurling objects from the trees. Max suddenly had enough and charged into the woods, snarling fiercely. There was an ear-splitting scream, followed by the sound of a violent struggle. I chased after Max, rifle at the ready, but then a rock struck me in the head, dazing me. Blood poured down my face, and I stumbled back to the cabin, locking myself inside. Max returned moments later, covered in mud, blood, and leaves, looking shaken, but alive. I checked my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I reloaded my rifle, filled the magazine, and considered driving into town to call the sheriff. But I decided to stay put and defend the cabin. I was scared, but the intruders should have been more scared of me. I had a gun, and Max clearly held his own in a fight. I spent the rest of the day in siege mode, keeping the generator running for lights, cooking dinner, and keeping watch. The motion-triggered lights went off several times, but I saw nothing. Eventually, I shut off the generator and went to bed, revolver under my pillow and rifle leaning against the wall. The next day, the woods were eerily quiet. Max was acting nervous again, and I decided to stay inside the cabin all day. By nightfall, the tension was unbearable. I refueled the generator, started it up, and went into the kitchen to cook dinner. The motion lights kept going off, but still, I saw nothing. Max was whining and pacing nervously. As I stirred the pot on the stove, I noticed something outside the kitchen window. Something was looking in at me. I couldn't make out what it was, just a pair of eyes and a dark silhouette. I shouted and drew my revolver, pointing it at the window. But whatever it was vanished into the darkness. I ran to the window just as the motion lights flicked on, catching a glimpse of a massive shadow disappearing into the trees. Whatever was outside must have been huge, much larger than any bear. My heart pounded as I holstered my gun, turned down the stove, and grabbed the rifle. I stepped out the kitchen door, flashlight in hand, and began scanning the tree line. The generator sputtered, coughed, and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled my way back into the cabin, barking my shin on the coffee table, and grabbed a flashlight by the door. Stepping back onto the porch, I restarted the generator, and the lights came back on. But then, I heard shattering glass from the kitchen. Rushing back inside, I saw a long, hairy arm reaching through the broken window, grabbing the pot of stew from the stove. I fired the revolver at the window, and the creature let out an ear-splitting screech, dropping the pot. I ran to the window just in time to see the enormous figure vanish into the trees again. With adrenaline pumping, I grabbed my rifle and ran upstairs to the bedroom. I reloaded the revolver and checked the window. The motion lights were on, but there was no sign of anything. I headed back downstairs, cautiously stepping out the kitchen door. Max was too scared to follow. As I stood at the edge of the yard, flashlight scanning the woods, I realized something horrifying. The lights hadn't gone out. Something massive was standing between me and the lights, blocking them. I barely avoided panicking and fired the rifle at the silhouette. There was a scream, and a figure that looked vaguely human bolted into the trees. Then, from another direction, rocks started flying at me again. There were more than one of them. I fired another shot, then another, before drawing my revolver and emptying it into the woods. Another roar echoed through the night, followed by the sound of Max and I ran back to the cabin with the unseen assailant pursuing us, hurling objects from the trees. Max suddenly had enough and charged into the woods, snarling fiercely. There was an ear-splitting scream, followed by the sound of a violent struggle. I chased after Max, rifle at the ready, but then a rock struck me in the head, dazing me. Blood poured down my face, and I stumbled back to the cabin, locking myself inside. Max returned moments later, covered in mud, blood, and leaves, looking shaken but alive. I checked my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I reloaded my rifle, filled the magazine, and considered driving into town to call the sheriff. But I decided to stay put and defend the cabin. I was scared, but the intruders should have been more scared of me. I had a gun, and Max clearly held his own in a fight. I spent the rest of the day in siege mode, keeping the generator running for lights, cooking dinner, and keeping watch. The motion-triggered lights went off several times, but I saw nothing. Eventually, I shut off the generator and went to bed, revolver under my pillow and rifle leaning against the wall. The next day, the woods were eerily quiet. Max was acting nervous again, and I decided to stay inside the cabin all day. By nightfall, the tension was unbearable. It was the kind of rain that drowned out all other sounds, the kind that made the dense jungle feel like it was closing in around you. Every leaf and branch was dripping, the relentless downpour turning the earth into thick mud. I had been hiking for hours, trying to find my way back to camp, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees all twisted into the same dark shapes, their trunks obscured by the mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. My boots sloshed through puddles, the water seeping in through every seam. felt the weight of the soaked backpack on my shoulders, pulling me down with each step. The jungle had gone eerily quiet, save for the steady patter of rain on leaves. Even the birds, who had been so loud earlier, were now silent. It was as if the entire jungle was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when I saw it, or thought I saw it. A flash of movement in my peripheral vision. Something massive, moving quickly between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my eyes, peering into the dense foliage, but there was nothing. Just shadows. My imagination playing tricks on me, I told myself, shaking my head. But then I heard it. A low growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and I had spent enough time in the jungle to know its inhabitants. This was something different, something bigger. I turned slowly, scanning the jungle around me. The rain made it hard to see, the droplets forming a thick curtain that blurred the edges of everything. But I could feel it. I wasn't alone. The growl came again, closer this time. My hands trembled as I reached for the machete strapped to my belt, the only thing I had to defend myself. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then, through the mist, I saw it. A massive figure, easily 8 feet tall, covered in matted dark hair. It stood on 2 legs, its broad shoulders hunched as it observed me with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. My breath hitched as I realized what I was looking at. The stories had always seemed like a joke. Bigfoot, the legendary creature of the deep woods, something people talked about around campfires. But here it was, real and terrifying. It moved with a surprising grace for something so large, stepping out from behind the trees with a fluid motion. The rain streamed off its fur in rivulets, but it didn't seem to care. It just stared at me, those glowing eyes unblinking. I was frozen in place, unable to move or even scream. All I could do was clutch the machete, though I knew it would be useless against something like this. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. The only sound was the rain, drumming on the leaves above, masking the creature's movements. And then, without warning, it let out a deafening roar, a sound so powerful that it shook the trees and sent birds screeching into the sky. My survival instincts kicked in, and I ran. I didn't care where I was going, just that I needed to get away. The jungle blurred around me as I sprinted, branches slashing at my face, the mud threatening to pull me down with every step. But I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. I veered off the path, hoping to lose it in the thick foliage. But it was no use. The creature was faster, stronger, more at home in this jungle than I could ever be. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, smell the rank odor of wet fur and earth. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, it would be the end. I don't know how long I ran, the fear pushing me beyond my limits. But eventually, the ground gave way beneath me, and I tumbled down a steep embankment, crashing through vines and branches until I hit the bottom. Pain shot through my body, but I forced myself to stand, ignoring the throbbing in my leg. I looked up the slope, expecting to see the creature barreling down after me. But there was nothing, just the rain and the darkness. I waited, heart racing, straining to hear anything over the sound of the storm. But all was silent. The jungle had returned to its oppressive, watchful stillness. Had I lost it? Was it still out there, waiting in the shadows? I didn't know, and that terrified me more than anything. I limped through the jungle, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch sending my heart into my throat. The creature was out there, somewhere, and it had let me go, for now. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The jungle had secrets, dark and ancient, and I had just crossed paths with one of them. I never found my way back to camp. When the search party found me days later, delirious and on the brink of collapse, I could barely speak. But even as they led me to safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the creature was out there, hiding in the rain-soaked jungle, waiting for me to return. And I knew one thing for certain: I would never go back. In the spring of 1992, my girlfriend Sarah and I, along with 5 other college friends, decided to spend our spring break hiking and camping in the Sierra Nevada mountains. One of our friends, Matt, had a father who grew up in that area and recommended a spot near a place called Blue Lake. We were all excited, eager to escape the pressures of college life and immerse ourselves in nature. The hike into the mountains was breathtaking, and by the time we set up camp, we had a beautiful view of the lake below. There were 7 of us in total, and we planned to stay for a few days. On the second evening, around 7 p.m., we finished our dinner and were wrapping up the dishes. One of the other couples, Jenny and Mike, decided to take a walk to find a good spot to watch the sunset. About an hour later, Jenny and Mike came running back into camp, their faces pale with fear. They were both out of breath, and it took a moment for them to explain what they had seen. They had been sitting on a rock ledge, enjoying the view, when they noticed a pine tree shaking violently in the distance. The trees in that area were somewhat spaced out, so the sight of one tree shaking wildly stood out. As they watched, they glimpsed a large black figure moving through the trees. At first, they thought it was a bear, but something about it didn't seem right. The creature was running in an unusual way, almost as if it were deformed, propelling itself forward with its front limbs, while barely using its back legs. The more they watched, the more they realized it wasn't a bear at all. Jenny described it as the biggest, strangest looking ape I've ever seen. The creature then did something even more unsettling. It transitioned from moving on all 4s to casually walking on 2 legs. It paused, staring out over the valley, and then sat down with its back to them. They estimated it was at least 6 feet tall, even when sitting. Although it had clearly noticed them, it seemed indifferent to their presence. When Mike mentioned what they saw, Sarah, ever the skeptic, laughed nervously and said, "Maybe it's Bigfoot." But instead of laughing it off, Matt's eyes lit up with curiosity, and he suggested we all go and check it out. Against our better judgment, we agreed and made our way to the spot where Jenny and Mike had seen the creature. By the time we arrived, the creature was gone. Disappointed, we turned our attention to the darkening sky. That's when Matt pointed to the east and asked, "Do you guys see that?" We all looked up and saw strange, spinning lights hovering in the distance. Though we couldn't see the source of the lights, they moved in patterns that made no sense. Suddenly, we heard a deep, resonant moan from somewhere nearby. The sound was so intense, it seemed to vibrate through the ground, lasting a full minute before it stopped. Then, a high-pitched whoop echoed from a different direction, and the spinning lights above resumed their strange dance. This eerie sequence repeated several times, with each cycle bringing the lights closer. We were all on edge, trying to make sense of what we were experiencing. Just as the tension seemed unbearable, someone noticed something moving in the trees. One of the guys, Tom, shouted, "Look, over there!" We all turned and saw a small figure, about 4 feet tall, darting between the trees. But it wasn't just small. It was glowing, emitting a silvery white light. Fear began to creep into the group. As we stared, the figure moved up a tree with shocking speed. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and pointed. There, about 10 feet up in the tree, was a creature with large, bulbous eyes, each the size of a baseball. It clung to the tree with long, spindly fingers that ended in what looked like suction cups. We were paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, there was a loud crack as a tree limb broke somewhere behind us. Tom swore he saw red eyes glowing in the darkness, moving quickly out of sight. Then Jenny screamed, and we all turned to see what she was pointing at there. Standing at the edge of our campsite was the creature they had described earlier. It was massive, at least 10 feet tall, and it swayed back and forth as it stared at us. Its breathing was heavy and labored, each exhale accompanied by a low growl. We stood frozen, unsure whether to run or stay put. As we watched, another lighted figure, much brighter than the small one we had seen earlier, appeared near the creature. Without a sound, the giant figure turned and began to walk toward the light, leaving our campsite behind. That was our chance. We didn't pack anything. We just ran. We sprinted back down the trail, through the darkness, until we reached our cars. The next day, a few of us returned in the daylight to retrieve our belongings. Everything was exactly as we had left it, untouched. Not even the food coolers had been disturbed. None of us ever returned to that spot. We still keep in touch, but the events of that night are something we rarely discuss. It feels too surreal, too otherworldly to be real. But the memories linger, a constant reminder of the strange things that lurk in the shadows of the Sierra Nevada mountains.